Chapter 1. Developed in Darkness. The carefully tended garden of Miss Jane Marple was in full bloom that spring afternoon, a riot of colour that made the modest cottage seem like a small piece of paradise carved out of the English countryside. Miss Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair and remarkably sharp blue eyes, was attending to her roses with the same methodical care that she applied to solving puzzles of human nature. She paused, secateurs in hand, to observe the comings and goings at the old gatehouse of Gossington Hall across the lane. The new tenant, Mr. Lawrence Redding, had caused quite a stir in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead since his arrival 3 weeks prior. A celebrated photographer working on a book of rural English landscapes, he had quickly become the topic of conversation at every tea table in the village. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Blackett, the postmistress, as she passed by. "Another fine day, isn't it? I've just delivered a rather heavy package to Mr. Redding. More photographic supplies, I expect?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "He seems to be quite industrious." "Oh, he is. And so charming. He's taken to photographing the locals, you know. Portraits, he calls them. Mrs. Bantry sat for him just yesterday." Miss Marple nodded, having already noted the Colonel's wife visiting the gatehouse, dressed in her finest silk dress. She had also observed the vicar's young daughter, a rather impressionable girl in Miss Marple's opinion, lingering at the photographer's door far longer than necessary when delivering a message from her father. More curious, however, was the visit paid by Mrs. Lestrange, the mysterious widow who had taken up residence in the old Darnley cottage 6 months ago, and who rarely participated in village activities. Miss Marple had watched her arrive at precisely 3 o'clock, wrapped in a dark cloak despite the mild weather, and depart exactly 45 minutes later, her expression unreadable. "People are so revealing, aren't they?" Miss Marple murmured to herself as she returned to her gardening. Human nature, she had long believed, was much the same everywhere. The villagers of St. Mary Mead provided her with a microcosm of all human experience, if one only knew how to observe properly. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when Miss Marple finally put away her secateurs and garden gloves. She had just settled in her sitting room with a cup of tea and her knitting, when an urgent knocking at the door startled her. Opening it, she found a young man on her doorstep, his face pale with distress. She recognized him as Peter Carmichael, Mr. Redding's assistant, whom she had seen carrying equipment and packages to and from the gatehouse. "Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice strained. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I'm terribly worried. Mr. Redding went to photograph the Abbey ruins this afternoon, and he hasn't returned. It's been hours, and darkness is falling." "Dear me," Miss Marple said, taking in the young man's genuine concern. "And this is unlike him, I gather?" "Completely. He's always punctual, always professional. He was meant to be back by 6 to develop today's photographs. I've called out at the ruins, but there was no answer." Miss Marple glanced at the clock. It was now 8:30. "Have you informed the police?" she asked. "Not yet. I thought perhaps... Well, I thought I might be overreacting. But as I was passing, I remembered seeing you watching the gatehouse. You strike me as someone observant, someone who might... help." Miss Marple considered this. The Abbey ruins were not far, perhaps a 15-minute walk across the fields. She had known those ruins since childhood, every crumbling wall and fallen arch. "I'll come with you," she decided, reaching for her cardigan and sturdy walking shoes. 2 pairs of eyes are better than one. They set out immediately, Peter leading the way with a torch he had brought. The evening was clear, but moonless, the path to the Abbey illuminated only by their torch and the distant stars. Miss Marple walked with surprising sureness for a woman of her years, her mind cataloguing possibilities. The ruins loomed before them, the skeletal remains of what had once been a magnificent abbey, dissolved during the reign of Henry VIII. By day, it was a picturesque spot, popular with artists and visitors. By night, it took on a more sinister aspect, the stones seeming to guard ancient secrets. "Mr. Redding," Peter called out, his voice echoing among the stones. "Lawrence." There was no response but the soft hooting of an owl. Where exactly was he planning to photograph? Miss Marple asked, her eyes scanning the shadowy ruins. "The north transept, I believe. He wanted to capture the moonlight through the rose window." They made their way carefully through the ruins, Peter's torch beam dancing across the ancient stones. As they rounded a fallen column, the light suddenly illuminated a prone figure lying beside a tripod. "Lawrence?" Peter rushed forward, Miss Marple following more cautiously behind. Lawrence Redding lay face up, his eyes open but unseeing, a curious expression of shock frozen on his features. His camera was missing from the tripod beside him, but clutched in his right hand was a strip of photographic negatives, partially exposed to the moonlight and ruined. "Oh, God," Peter whispered, kneeling beside the body. He's dead." Miss Marple bent down, her movements careful and deliberate. She noted that Redding's watch had stopped at 4:17, though it was now past 9. His camera bag nearby had been meticulously searched, its contents arranged with an unnatural neatness that suggested someone other than the photographer had gone through them. "We must not touch anything more," she said firmly. "The police must be called immediately." As Peter fumbled for his mobile phone, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something half hidden beneath a fallen stone, a single photographic print. Using her knitting needle, she carefully lifted the edge of the stone to reveal the image. What appeared to be the silhouette of a person watching from the Abbey's bell tower, a location that had been presumed inaccessible for decades. Inspector Slack arrived with characteristic efficiency, his perpetual frown deepening as he surveyed the scene. After a cursory examination, he pronounced, "Accident, most likely. Probably tripped and hit his head while setting up. These old ruins are treacherous in the dark." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, though one wonders why his watch stopped at 4:17 when it was still quite light. The inspector gave her an irritated glance. "Probably broke in the fall, Miss Marple." "Possibly," she conceded. "Though, have you noticed, Inspector, the small puncture wound at the base of his skull? It's nearly invisible among his thick hair." The inspector bent closer, his torch illuminating what was indeed a small, neat puncture, like that made by a thin, sharp instrument. He grunted, his tone shifting. "You'll need the medical examiner." As the police began their work, securing the scene and taking statements, Miss Marple and Peter were eventually allowed to leave. They walked back to the village in silence, both lost in thought. "I should check the gatehouse," Peter said as they reached the village green. "Make sure everything is as it should be." Miss Marple accompanied him, her curiosity now fully engaged. The gatehouse was a small but charming building, the ground floor given over to a living area and kitchen, while the upper floor had been converted into a studio and darkroom. The moment they entered, it was clear something was wrong. The living area appeared untouched, but when they ascended to the studio, they found chaos. The darkroom had been ransacked, chemicals spilled, equipment scattered. Most telling of all, every photograph and negative appeared to have been systematically destroyed. "All his work," Peter whispered in horror. "All his recent work, gone." Miss Marple's eyes caught sight of something that had fallen behind a cabinet, a small envelope that had escaped the destruction. She retrieved it carefully and saw with surprise that it was addressed to her. Inside was a photograph of St. Mary Mead's village green, seemingly innocent and unremarkable. But turning it over, she found a message written in a firm hand. Some things develop only in darkness. Miss Marple stared at the cryptic words, a slight frown creasing her forehead. Lawrence Redding, it seemed, had anticipated danger, and for some reason he had chosen to reach out to her. Chapter 2. The Negative Evidence. The morning after the discovery of Lawrence Redding's body dawned bright and clear, belying the dark events of the previous night. Miss Marple, who had slept little, was already at her breakfast table, the photograph of the village green propped against the marmalade pot as she studied it with her magnifying glass. To the casual observer, it showed nothing remarkable. The peaceful green with its ancient oak, the post office, the vicarage gate, and a scatter of villagers going about their business. But Miss Marple was no casual observer. Her keen eyes noted several peculiarities. A bicycle leaning at an oddly specific angle against the war memorial, a newspaper left open on a bench, and most curiously, a small hand mirror positioned on the stone wall, angled to reflect something just outside the frame. Clever, she murmured to herself. Very clever indeed. The ringing of the telephone interrupted her contemplation. It was Dolly Bantry, Colonel Bantry's wife, and one of Miss Marple's oldest friends. Jane, I've just heard the most dreadful news. That poor photographer found dead, and I only sat for him last week. You simply must come for coffee and tell me everything. Half an hour later, Miss Marple was settled in Dolly's drawing room at Gossington Hall, a delicate china cup in her hand. It's quite shocking, Dolly said, pouring coffee. And they're saying it wasn't an accident after all. Murder in St. Mary Mead again. One would think we were living in Chicago rather than a quiet English village. Inspector Slack has confirmed it was murder, then? Miss Marple asked. Oh, yes. The medical examiner found some sort of puncture wound, like an ice pick, they're saying. Most theatrical. Dolly shuddered delicately. But Jane, there was something odd about him when I sat for my portrait. He seemed preoccupied. In what way? Well, he kept checking his watch, for one thing, and he asked the strangest questions about the village families. Old history, you know. Particularly about families who'd been here for generations. Dolly paused, frowning slightly. He seemed especially interested in the history of Gossington Hall before we bought it. Asked about the previous owners. That does seem curious for a man supposedly focused on landscape photography, Miss Marple observed. Exactly. And then, Dolly lowered her voice dramatically, he asked if I knew anything about a family called Hargreaves. The name meant nothing to me, but he seemed so intent. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Did you mention any of this to Inspector Slack? Not yet. I only remembered it just now talking to you. Should I? I think that would be wise, Miss Marple said, setting down her cup. Any detail, however small, might be important. Meanwhile, at the police station, Inspector Slack was interviewing Peter Carmichael, his manner brusque and impatient. So, Mr. Carmichael, exactly what was your relationship with the deceased? Peter, pale and drawn, clasped and unclasped his hands. I was his assistant. I've worked with Lawrence for about 8 months. He hired me after I graduated from art school. And what exactly did your duties entail? I helped with equipment, processed film sometimes, managed his schedule, basic assistant work. And Mr. Redding's current projects? He was working on 2, Peter explained. The landscape book, which was his official reason for being in St. Mary Mead, rural English landscapes through the seasons. But there was another project, something personal. He called it Shadows of the Past. He was very secretive about it. Secretive how? Slack pressed. He would disappear for hours, saying he was researching. He spent a lot of time in the local records office and interviewing elderly residents, and he received packages from a London photographic archive. After leaving the police station, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the church flower arrangements, but with a more specific purpose in mind. Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, was all too eager to discuss the recent tragedy. "Such a dreadful business," she said, pouring tea. "And to think, Amelia was with him just days ago for her portrait." "Amelia?" Miss Marple inquired, referring to the vicar's daughter. "Yes, he offered to photograph her for her university application. Quite kind, really. She was so nervous. Brought an old family photograph for inspiration. Her grandmother at the same age, you see." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said. "Did she mention anything unusual about the session?" Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. Well, she did say he was oddly interested in the old photograph. Asked who everyone in it was when it was taken. Even asked to make a copy of it. Did she allow him to? Yes, didn't see the harm. But she said he was particularly interested in someone in the background, a woman she couldn't identify. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. "Between us, Jane, I found the whole thing rather odd. What interest could he have in our old family photographs?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, quite odd. Her next visit was to the post office, where Miss Blackett, the postmistress, was only too willing to share local gossip under the guise of selling stamps. "Those packages he received?" Miss Marple said casually. "You mentioned they were photographic supplies?" "Some were," Miss Blackett replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But others came from the London Photographic Archive. Very official looking. And there were telegrams too." Telegrams? How fascinating, in this day and age. He insisted on them, said they were more secure than email or telephone. Miss Blackett's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of sharing privileged information. Most were to someone called Hargreaves, 3 just last week, all marked urgent. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Hargreaves, you say? Did you happen to notice the address?" "London somewhere. Kensington, I think." Miss Blackett frowned, trying to recall. "The last one was different, though. Sent the day before. Well, before it happened. That one went to someone at New Scotland Yard." This revelation gave Miss Marple much to consider as she walked back toward the Abbey ruins. The police had finished their examination of the scene, the yellow tape removed, allowing her to explore more thoroughly in daylight. The ancient stones stood silent under the afternoon sun, betraying nothing of the tragedy that had occurred there. Miss Marple made her way carefully to the spot where Redding's body had been found. With no one to observe her, she examined the area meticulously, noting the position of the tripod markings, the disturbed earth where the body had lain. Something about the stone wall nearby caught her attention. Moving closer, she ran her fingers lightly over the weathered surface, feeling a slight difference in one section. Pressing gently, she was startled when a small portion of the wall moved, revealing a hidden compartment about the size of a paperback book. It was empty now, but as she ran her fingers along the interior, she felt the faint imprint of what must have been a small box or case. The compartment had been recently emptied. A few grains of fresh mortar dust still clung to the edges. Miss Marple. What a coincidence. She turned to see Sir Henry, Clithering, approaching, his tall figure distinctive against the ruins. A retired commissioner from Scotland Yard and an old friend, his presence in St. Mary Mead was surely no coincidence at all. "Sir Henry," she greeted him warmly. "I had a feeling we might be seeing you." He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I received your letter this morning. Posted before the unfortunate event, I believe." "Yes," she confirmed. "I had some questions about photographic techniques used in police work. Questions that now seem rather more urgent than when I wrote them." Sir Henry glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Your instincts, as always, are remarkable. Lawrence Redding was not merely a landscape photographer." "No," she agreed. "I had begun to suspect as much. He worked with us periodically, specializing in crime scene photography and document analysis. He had an extraordinary eye for detail, could spot manipulations and inconsistencies that others missed." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "And was he working on something official here in St. Mary Mead?" "Not officially, no. But he had become interested in a series of cold cases, with possible connections to prominent families. Old cases, some dating back 50 years or more." "The Hargreaves case," she suggested. Sir Henry's eyebrows rose. "You are well informed." "Yes, the Hargreaves disappearance was one of them. But how did you know?" "Fragments of information pieced together," she explained. "Mr. Redding made inquiries about the Hargreaves family, sent telegrams to someone of that name, and asked questions about the history of certain village families." "Classic Redding," Sir Henry said with a sad smile. "He believed photographs could reveal truths hidden to the naked eye. 'The camera remembers what people forget,' he used to say." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple shared her discovery of the hidden compartment. Sir Henry agreed to inform Inspector Slack, though he doubted anything would be found now. "Whatever was hidden there is long gone," he said. "But it might tell us what Redding was looking for." They parted at the village green, Sir Henry heading to the police station, while Miss Marple returned home to examine the photograph once more. The message on the back, "Some things develop only in darkness," seemed increasingly significant. As evening fell, a telephone call disrupted her contemplation. It was Inspector Slack, his voice tense. "Miss Marple, there's been another incident. Mr. Carmichael has been found unconscious in Redding's darkroom. Poisoned, it seems. And there's a message on the wall, written in developer fluid. I know what he saw. We're taking him to the hospital now, but I thought you should know." Miss Marple thanked him for the information, her mind racing. 2 attempts to silence those connected to Lawrence Redding, 2 attempts to destroy evidence. Someone was desperate to keep a secret that had been hidden for decades, but that Redding had somehow uncovered. As she put down the telephone, her gaze fell once more on the photograph of the village green, the mirror positioned to reflect something just out of frame. What had Redding seen? And more importantly, what had he wanted her to see? The hospital corridor was quiet when Miss Marple arrived, having persuaded her neighbour to drive her. Peter Carmichael lay pale against the white sheets, a doctor checking his vital signs. "He's stable," the doctor informed her. "Lucky someone found him quickly. The chemical wasn't meant to kill, I think, just incapacitate. He should regain consciousness soon." Miss Marple waited patiently by the bedside, her knitting needles clicking softly. It was nearly midnight when Peter's eyes fluttered open. "Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice weak. "Yes, my dear. Try not to exert yourself." He licked his dry lips. "I remembered something Lawrence said about the Hargreaves case. He found something in an old photograph, something that changed everything." His voice faded as exhaustion overcame him again. Miss Marple patted his hand gently. Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. The next morning found Miss Marple at the village records office, a small room in the back of the town hall where centuries of local history were stored in dusty ledgers. The elderly clerk, Mr. Parsons, was only too happy to assist her. I'm researching old village families, she explained, particularly any named Hargreaves. Mr. Parsons nodded thoughtfully. Hargreaves? Yes. They owned the manor house before the Bantrys. Old family. Died out some time ago. Let me see what we have. He shuffled through the records, eventually producing a leather-bound volume. Here we are. Property transfers from 1890 to 1910. The Hargreaves estate was sold in 1900, following the death of the last heir, Miss Eleanor Hargreaves. Death? Miss Marple inquired. May I ask how she died? Mr. Parsons lowered his voice, though they were alone. Suicide, according to the records. Body found in the Abbey ruins in December 1899. Tragic affair. She was only 23. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. The Abbey ruins, you say? Yes, same place as this recent tragedy. Strange coincidence, isn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, examining the records more closely. Very strange indeed. Chapter 3. Portraits of the Deceased. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, illuminating the breakfast table where she sat with Sir Henry Clithering. Their cups of tea grew cold as they discussed the increasingly complex web surrounding Lawrence Redding's murder. Tell me more about his police work, Miss Marple prompted, setting aside her toast untouched. Sir Henry folded his hands thoughtfully. Redding had a particular genius for finding discrepancies in photographic evidence. He could identify subtle manipulations, alterations that most experts would miss. In recent years, he'd become fascinated with cold cases, particularly those where photographic evidence might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. And this brought him to St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple asked, her blue eyes sharp with interest. Not officially. He approached me 3 months ago with a theory about several unsolved cases that he believed were connected to prominent families in this region. I advised caution. These were old wounds, powerful people. But Lawrence was persistent, said he had found a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The Hargreaves case being one of them? Yes, though I never understood his fixation on that particular case. A tragic suicide from the previous century seemed an odd focus for his investigation. Sir Henry frowned. But Lawrence was convinced the official record was incomplete, perhaps deliberately so. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, his expression grim as Miss Marple ushered him into the sitting room. "We've found something," he announced without preamble. Carmichael's statement led us to search Redding's desk more thoroughly. We found this, hidden in a false bottom. He produced a small notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. It's his appointment book. Most entries are mundane, portrait sessions, landscape locations. But there's a pattern here that's quite curious. He opened the book to a marked page. Look at these meetings, all with elderly residents of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bellwether, Mr. Simmons, old Mrs. Crawford, Mr. Jenkins, the former groundskeeper at Gossington Hall, all over 75, all living in the village for more than 50 years. Miss Marple examined the list with interest. He was collecting memories, piecing together a history that existed only in the recollections of these long-time residents. Precisely, Slack agreed, uncharacteristically animated, and all these meetings occurred before his official arrival in the village. He was investigating long before he rented the gatehouse. This revelation gave Miss Marple much to consider. After Inspector Slack departed, she shared her intention to visit Mrs. Lestrange with Sir Henry. The mysterious widow, Sir Henry mused. What's your interest in her? She was one of Redding's portrait subjects, one of his last, in fact. And unlike most villagers, she showed no interest in village affairs until his arrival. I find the timing suggestive. The Darnley cottage stood at the edge of the village, partially hidden by tall yew hedges. Miss Marple approached it with purpose, noting the well-tended garden and discreetly drawn curtains. Her knock was answered promptly by Mrs. Lestrange herself, a tall, elegant woman somewhere in her 50s, with striking features and prematurely silver hair. Miss Marple, she acknowledged with cool politeness, this is unexpected. I apologize for calling unannounced, Miss Marple replied, her manner deliberately mild. But in light of recent events, I hoped we might have a brief conversation. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Lestrange stepped aside. Please come in. The cottage interior was sparely furnished, but with items of unmistakable quality. No photographs or personal mementos were visible, Miss Marple noted, unusual for a widow who typically displayed reminders of her past life. I understand you sat for a portrait with Mr. Redding shortly before his death? Miss Marple began once they were seated. Mrs. Lestrange's expression remained impassive. Yes, he was quite persuasive. I rarely participate in such things, but he was most insistent. And did you find him professional? A flicker of something, wariness perhaps, crossed Mrs. Lestrange's face. Quite, though he had a disconcerting habit of asking personal questions while he worked, about my background, my reasons for choosing Saint Mary Mead. She paused. Why do you ask? Miss Marple chose her words carefully. Mr. Redding left behind some unfinished business. I'm trying to understand what he was working on before his death. I'm afraid I can't help you there, Mrs. Lestrange replied, her tone cooling further. Our acquaintance was brief and purely professional. I see. Miss Marple adjusted her approach. I've recently learned that Mr. Redding had an interest in historical cases, particularly one involving a family named Hargreaves. The name wouldn't mean anything to you, I suppose? The effect was immediate. Mrs. Lestrange's composure faltered, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. I'm afraid I'm not feeling well, Miss Marple. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time. Miss Marple rose obediently. Of course. I do apologize. Though before I go, might I use your bathroom? Once directed to it, Miss Marple took the opportunity to glance into the adjoining bedroom. Unlike the impersonal sitting room, this space held clues to Mrs. Lestrange's true nature. A silver-framed photograph face down on the nightstand, a worn leather journal beside it, and most tellingly, a small carved box that Miss Marple recognized as exactly the right size to have fit the hidden compartment in the abbey wall. Rejoining her hostess, Miss Marple thanked her pleasantly and took her leave, her mind working rapidly. Mrs. Lestrange's reaction to the Hargreaves name had been unmistakable, and if the box in her possession was indeed what Redding had hidden in the abbey wall, then she was more deeply involved than she claimed. Sir Henry was waiting at Miss Marple's cottage, concern evident in his expression. Any success? Some, she replied thoughtfully, though Mrs. Lestrange is a most guarded individual. But her reaction to the Hargreaves name was quite revealing. She described the interview, including her observations of the bedroom. The question remains, Sir Henry mused, what connection could exist between a reclusive widow, a photographer investigating cold cases, and a family tragedy from over half a century ago? The answer to this question would have to wait, for at that moment the telephone rang. It was Inspector Slack, his voice tense with urgency. Miss Marple, there's been a development at the hospital. Carmichael is conscious and asking for you specifically. Says he has information, but will only share it with you. Within the hour, Miss Marple was seated beside Peter Carmichael's hospital bed. Though still pale, the young man was alert, his eyes darting nervously to the door, as if expecting an intruder. I remembered more, he said, without preamble, his voice low. About the Hargreaves case. Lawrence showed me photographs, old crime scene images from the original investigation. He'd found them in some archive, paid a fortune to access them. And what did these photographs show? Miss Marple prompted gently. A young woman's body, found at the Abbey ruins. Suicide, the report said. But Lawrence spotted inconsistencies. The way the body was positioned, the marks on her neck, the arrangement of her clothing, all wrong for suicide. He believed it was staged. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Did he share any other conclusions? Peter's voice dropped even lower. He said he'd found a connection between the Hargreaves case and other deaths. Accidents, suicides, all involving young women who had relationships with powerful men. But the key was a photograph taken at a village fete in 1899, showing Eleanor Hargreaves alive weeks after her supposed suicide. Miss Marple's eyes widened. Are you certain? Lawrence was. He'd verified the date of the photograph through multiple sources. He believed Eleanor Hargreaves didn't die in 1899, that she escaped, changed her identity, and that someone helped her do it, someone who later paid with their life. This revelation cast everything in a new light. If Eleanor Hargreaves had not died as reported, what had become of her? And whose body had been found in the Abbey ruins? Miss Marple was still pondering these questions when she returned home to find her cottage had been searched in her absence. Nothing appeared to be missing, but her desk drawers stood slightly ajar, her papers rearranged with careful subtlety that most would have missed. Most disturbing of all, the photograph of the village green was now propped against her bedside lamp, as if the intruder had wanted her to know they had found it. That evening, Miss Marple visited the Village Historical Society's modest museum, housed in a room above the library. Mrs. Prescott, the elderly curator, was delighted by her interest. The Hargreaves family? Oh yes, they were quite prominent in the late Victorian era. The last of the line was Eleanor, such a tragic story. I understand she died young, Miss Marple prompted. Yes, just 23. Found dead at the Abbey ruins in December 1899. The official finding was suicide, though there were whispers. Whispers. Mrs. Prescott glanced around, though they were alone. That she was in the family way, you understand. And the father was a married man from a prominent family. These things were hushed up in those days, of course. Do you have any photographs of Eleanor? A few in the family collection. Colonel Bantry donated them years ago. Found them during renovations at Gossington Hall. Caused quite a stir at the time. Mrs. Prescott shuffled through a drawer. Here we are. The Hargreaves collection. The folder she produced was thin, containing only a few photographs and documents. Miss Marple examined them carefully. Formal portraits of the family, an image of Gossington Hall when it was the Hargreaves estate, and several pages of correspondence. Has anyone accessed these materials recently? She asked. Mrs. Prescott consulted her ledger. Yes, just last month. Mr. Redding spent an afternoon studying them, and Mrs. Lestrange requested to see them the very next day. Quite a coincidence. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Quite a coincidence. As she prepared to leave, something caught her eye, a notation in Mrs. Prescott's ledger beside Mrs. Lestrange's name. Requested information on Emily Watkins, lady's maid to Eleanor Hargreaves. The maid. A new piece of the puzzle that might explain whose body had been found at the Abbey ruins all those years ago. Night had fallen by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage. Opening her door, she was immediately aware that someone had been there again. This time they had left something behind. A portrait photograph placed deliberately on her bedside table. It showed a young woman with delicate features and determined eyes, identified on the back as Eleanor Hargreaves, spring 1899. But most disturbingly, the eyes in the photograph had been scratched out with a pen, a silent warning that chilled Miss Marple to her core. Chapter 4. The Blurred Background. The defaced photograph of Eleanor Hargreaves lay on Inspector Slack's desk the next morning as Miss Marple explained the previous night's disturbing discovery. Sir Henry stood by the window, his expression grave. "A clear threat," Inspector Slack pronounced. "Someone wants you to stop asking questions, Miss Marple." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "someone wants me to ask the right questions." She turned to Sir Henry. "I believe it's time to visit Peter Carmichael again. He knows more about Redding's techniques, how he embedded clues in photographs." The hospital corridor was quiet as they made their way to Peter's room. Looking considerably stronger than the day before, he sat propped against pillows, a book abandoned at his side. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his eyes brightening. "And Sir Henry Clithering, I recognize you from Lawrence's photographs." After brief introductions, Miss Marple produced the village green photograph. "Peter, Lawrence sent this to me before he died. I believe it contains clues, but I need your expertise to understand them." Peter examined the photograph with a professional eye. Lawrence was brilliant at composing images with hidden meanings. Everything deliberate, nothing accidental. He pointed to key elements. The bicycle angle, the newspaper, the mirror, they're directional indicators. "Showing what?" Sir Henry asked. "Where to look next?" Peter traced the lines implied by the positioned objects. "They all point to the old village hall, specifically the east wing where the archives are kept." Miss Marple nodded. "The village records dating back to the 19th century. "Exactly. Lawrence believed the truth about Eleanor Hargreaves was hidden there, in plain sight for anyone who knew how to look." Peter hesitated. "There's something else. Lawrence discovered that several people connected to Eleanor's case died under suspicious circumstances in the years following her supposed suicide." "What people?" Sir Henry pressed. "Her lady's maid, Emily Watkins, found drowned 6 months later. The doctor who certified the cause of death, carriage accident within a year. And a local journalist who'd questioned the suicide verdict fell from a cliff while walking alone." Peter's voice dropped. Lawrence believed they were silenced. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully, all to protect a secret from long ago, a secret still dangerous enough to kill for today. While Sir Henry remained with Peter to gather additional details, Miss Marple departed for the village hall. Inspector Slack had reluctantly assigned a constable to follow discreetly, a concession to Sir Henry's concerns for her safety. In the archives, she found Inspector Slack himself interviewing Mr. Simmons, the oldest resident on Redding's appointment list. "Ah, Miss Marple," Slack said with unusual deference. "Mr. Simmons was just telling me about Redding's interest in Eleanor Hargreaves." The elderly man nodded vigorously. "Showed me old photographs, he did. Asked if I remembered the Hargreaves family, particularly the young Miss Eleanor." "And did you?" Miss Marple inquired. I was just a lad when she died, 12 or so. But there were whispers afterward. People said it wasn't suicide at all. What did they say it was? Mr. Simmons leaned forward conspiratorially. Murder, some said, on account of her condition, and the father being who he was. And who was the father? Inspector Slack demanded. The old man's eyes shifted nervously. Never said outright, but everyone knew she'd been seeing a gentleman from one of the county's finest families. Married man, much older. Some said it was Lord Bantry himself, the Colonel's father. This revelation sent Inspector Slack hurrying to question Colonel Bantry, while Miss Marple continued her examination of the records. Soon she discovered something troubling. Several pages from the 1899 registry appeared to have been carefully removed, pages covering the weeks before and after Eleanor's death. She was pondering this discovery when the vicar entered, looking surprised to find her among the dusty archives. Miss Marple, research for your garden history? Something like that, she replied with a smile. Tell me, Vicar, would there be duplicate records of births, deaths, and marriages from this period? Certainly. The church registers would contain the same information. They're kept in the vestry. This proved a valuable lead. In the church vestry, with the vicar's permission, Miss Marple examined the parish records. There she found what the village archives were missing. The complete entries for December 1899, including Eleanor Hargreaves's death certificate and burial record. Most illuminating was a notation in the margin of the burial record, written in faded ink. No family present. Identity confirmed by Mrs. D only. Who was Mrs. D, and why was she the sole identifier of Eleanor's body? Her next stop was Gossington Hall, where she found Colonel Bantry in his study, visibly shaken after Inspector Slack's questioning. This business about my father, utterly preposterous, he declared upon Miss Marple's arrival. Father was a man of impeccable character. I'm sure, Miss Marple soothed, but I'm curious about the history of the house itself. I understand you found some Hargreaves's possessions during renovations? The Colonel's manner relaxed somewhat. Yes, years ago. Hidden compartment behind the library panelling, old photographs, letters, trinkets. Dolly insisted we donate them to the Historical Society. Do you recall anything specific about those items? Colonel Bantry frowned in concentration. There was a jewelry box, I remember. Contained a distinctive brooch, emerald, surrounded by pearls, family heirloom apparently, and photographs, of course. One showed Eleanor wearing the brooch at some garden party. The brooch. Miss Marple recalled seeing that very item in the photograph of Eleanor on her bedside table, the one with scratched-out eyes. The Village Historical Society was her next destination. Mrs. Prescott seemed surprised by her return. Back so soon, Miss Marple? More questions about the Hargreaves family? The items donated by Colonel Bantry, Miss Marple began. I understand they included jewelry? Yes, a few pieces. Beautiful craftsmanship. The emerald brooch was particularly fine. May I see it? Mrs. Prescott's expression turned apologetic. I'm afraid not. It was stolen 3 months ago, along with several other valuable items. We reported it to the police, of course, but nothing came of it. 3 months ago, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Just before Mr. Redding arrived in St. Mary Mead. As Miss Marple left the Historical Society, she noticed a familiar figure across the street, Mrs. Lestrange, watching her intently before turning away. The connection between the widow and the Hargreaves case grew stronger by the hour. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, dusk was falling. The house was quiet, undisturbed since morning. As she prepared tea, her mind worked methodically through the accumulated evidence. Eleanor Hargreaves, pregnant by a married man, possibly Lord Bantry, a staged suicide. The maid, Emily Watkins, who likely helped her escape, then paid with her life. The missing emerald brooch, recently stolen, and Lawrence Redding, piecing it all together through old photographs until someone silenced him. The telephone's ring startled her from these thoughts. It was Sir Henry. Jane. Peters shared something crucial. Redding discovered a pattern in the portrait sessions. He was systematically gathering family resemblances, comparing facial features across generations. Looking for Eleanor's descendants, Miss Marple concluded. He believed she escaped, started a new life under a different name. Precisely. And there's more. The emerald brooch you mentioned? Peter saw it recently, being worn by someone in the village. A chill ran through Miss Marple. Who? Henry? Who was wearing Eleanor's brooch? Before he could answer, there was a sharp click on the line, followed by silence. Night had fully descended by the time Miss Marple made her decision. She would need to act quickly, but not alone. She placed 2 telephone calls, one to Inspector Slack, the other to Sir Henry, leaving carefully worded messages for both. Then she wrote a brief note, sealed it in an envelope addressed to Inspector Slack, and placed it prominently on her mantelpiece. Whatever happened next, there would be a record of her thoughts and suspicions. As she completed these preparations, her telephone rang again. Mrs. Lestrange's voice came through, tightly controlled, but with an undercurrent of tension. Miss Marple, I must speak with you urgently. Could you come to my cottage? Now tonight? It's rather late, Mrs. Lestrange. It concerns Eleanor Hargreaves and Lawrence Redding. Please, it's important. Despite every instinct urging caution, Miss Marple agreed, but as she replaced the receiver, she made one final telephone call to Sir Henry, asking him to follow discreetly 20 minutes after her departure. The night air was crisp as Miss Marple made her way along the village lane toward the Darnley cottage. Stars glittered overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Eleanor Hargreaves's last night in St. Mary Mead, over 50 years ago. What secrets would tonight reveal? And at what cost? Chapter 5. Focus on Murder. The moon emerged from behind scudding clouds as Miss Marple approached the Darnley cottage. The windows glowed with warm light, yet the scene filled her with apprehension. The defaced photograph of Eleanor Hargreaves remained vividly in her mind, a warning she could not ignore. Before knocking, she paused to compose herself. Sir Henry would follow in 20 minutes, and Inspector Slack had been alerted. She had taken what precautions she could, but the next steps must be hers alone. With quiet resolve, she rapped firmly on the door. No answer came. She knocked again, louder this time. The door, to her surprise, swung inward at her touch. It had been left unlocked, or deliberately open. Mrs. Lestrange, she called, stepping cautiously into the hallway. It's Miss Marple. The sitting room was empty, though a lamp burned on the side table and 2 teacups had been arranged on a tray, steam still rising from the pot. Someone had been expecting her. Her attention was drawn to an object placed prominently on the mantelpiece, Lawrence Redding's camera, the one reported missing from the crime scene. Beside it lay a small velvet pouch. With gloved hands, she had been careful to put on her gardening gloves before entering, Miss Marple opened the pouch. Inside gleamed an emerald brooch surrounded by pearls, the Hargreaves heirloom, recently stolen from the Historical Society. I see you found my mother's brooch. Miss Marple turned sharply. Mrs. Lestrange stood in the doorway, her tall figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. "Your mother's?" Miss Marple repeated calmly, though her heart raced. "Please, sit down, Miss Marple." Mrs. Lestrange gestured to the armchair. "I believe we have much to discuss." Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Lestrange positioned herself between her and the door. "You said on the telephone this concerned Eleanor Hargreaves." "Yes." Mrs. Lestrange poured tea, offering a cup to Miss Marple. "She was my mother." Miss Marple politely declined the tea, observing with her sharp eyes a faint residue around the rim of the cup intended for her. "Eleanor Hargreaves didn't die in 1899, then?" "No." Mrs. Lestrange seemed almost relieved to speak the truth at last. "She fled, with help from her maid, Emily Watkins. The body found at the Abbey ruins was Emily's, dressed in my mother's clothes. Poor faithful Emily, who gave her life so my mother could escape." "Emily was already dead," Miss Marple stated with quiet certainty. "Murdered to facilitate the deception." Mrs. Lestrange didn't deny it. "My mother was desperate. Lord Bantry had threatened to kill her rather than acknowledge their child, me, and the scandal it would bring. Emily helped arrange everything, but someone had to be found in the ruins. A tragic suicide, case closed." "And Eleanor established a new life elsewhere?" "In France initially, then America. She married a kind man who accepted her and her child. We lived a modest but peaceful life." Mrs. Lestrange's voice hardened. "Until Lawrence Redding began digging into the past." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "How did he find you?" "Photographs. He had an uncanny ability to spot family resemblances across generations. He found a photograph of me at a charity event in London last year and recognized my likeness to Eleanor. Then he traced my movements to St. Mary Mead." "You returned to the village of your mother's shame. Why?" Mrs. Lestrange smiled thinly. "Closure, perhaps, or justice. My mother died still fearing the Bantry name, still haunted by what happened here." "And Lawrence Redding discovered the truth." "Yes. He approached me privately, showed me the evidence he'd gathered, crime scene photographs from my mother's suicide. Photographs showing discrepancies in the official record. He even found an image from a village fete, showing my mother with Lord Bantry, his signet ring clearly visible as he gripped her arm. The pieces were falling into place, but something still bothered Miss Marple. If Mr. Redding approached you with understanding, why kill him?" Mrs. Lestrange stiffened. "I didn't kill Lawrence. I was cooperating with him." "Then who did?" A noise from the adjoining room drew their attention. Peter Carmichael stepped into the sitting room, pale but steady, holding what appeared to be a photographic developing needle. Thin, sharp, and ideal for piercing the base of a skull. "I've been wondering that myself," he said. Mrs. Lestrange's composure faltered momentarily. "Mr. Carmichael, you should be in hospital." "I discharged myself. Couldn't miss our little gathering." Peter's gaze shifted between the two women. "I heard everything. Eleanor Hargreaves was your mother, but that doesn't explain who killed Lawrence." Miss Marple studied Peter's face, noting the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand. "I believe you have a theory, Mr. Carmichael." Peter nodded grimly. "Lawrence found more than Eleanor's escape. He discovered a connection to my own family. My grandfather was the local magistrate who helped cover up the truth about Eleanor's suicide, in exchange for Lord Bantry's patronage. That's why Lawrence hired me as his assistant, to watch me, to see if I knew." "And did you?" Mrs. Lestrange demanded. "Not until the end. Lawrence finally confided in me the night before he died. He said he'd found definitive proof linking the Hargreaves case to my family and to a recent death. Peter turned to Miss Marple. He'd discovered that Mrs. Lestrange had murdered her elderly mother, the real Eleanor, to gain her inheritance and silence the last witness to the original events. Mrs. Lestrange laughed, a brittle sound. Absurd. My mother died of natural causes at 87. Lawrence had proof, Peter insisted. Photographs of visiting what appeared to be a hiding place at the Abbey ruins, retrieving old letters that proved both the original deception and the recent murder. The tension in the room heightened as Mrs. Lestrange moved toward the mantelpiece, her hand inching toward the camera. Even if that were true, why would I kill Lawrence? He sympathized with my mother's plight. Because he discovered you weren't seeking justice, but revenge and money, Peter said. You came to blackmail the Bantry family using your mother's story, but then discovered she'd left behind evidence that implicated her in Emily's death. When Lawrence found that evidence, he became a threat to your plans. Miss Marple watched this exchange with growing clarity. She had been right to suspect that the truth was more complex than it appeared, but wrong about certain crucial details. As she observed Peter's increasing agitation, a new understanding began to form. Mr. Carmichael, she said gently, it wasn't Mrs. Lestrange who killed Lawrence Redding, was it? Peter's hand tightened around the developing needle. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Lawrence discovered the connection between your grandfather and the Hargreaves case, but that wasn't all. He found evidence that you were using that connection to blackmail Colonel Bantry yourself, threatening to expose his father's role in Eleanor's disappearance. Mrs. Lestrange's eyes widened. Is this true? Peter's face contorted with anger. My family was ruined because of that cover-up. My grandfather lost everything protecting the Bantrys while they prospered. Lawrence stumbled into my operation, threatened to expose me. I had no choice. So you killed him at the Abbey ruins? Miss Marple continued, her voice calm despite the danger. Using your knowledge of photography equipment to make it look like an interrupted photographic expedition. Then you destroyed his evidence at the gatehouse, except for the one photograph he'd already sent to me. I never meant to kill him, Peter said, voice cracking. I just wanted him to stop investigating, but he wouldn't listen, threatened to go to the police. It happened so quickly. I had the developing needle in my hand. And then you tried to silence yourself in the dark room, Miss Marple concluded, staging it to appear as another attack, writing that cryptic message to further confuse the investigation. The cottage fell silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, Miss Marple heard the faint crunch of gravel. Sir Henry, right on time. Peter seemed to sense the approaching end. His features hardened as he raised the developing needle. No one will believe either of you, the mysterious widow and the meddling old lady. Who would take your word over mine? Before he could move further, the cottage door burst open. Sir Henry Clithering stood there, flanked by Inspector Slack and 2 constables. I believe we would, Mr. Carmichael, Sir Henry said gravely. The developing needle clattered to the floor as Peter's shoulders slumped in defeat. Later, as statements were being taken and Peter led away, Miss Marple sat with Sir Henry and Mrs. Lestrange in the cottage garden. There's something I still don't understand, Sir Henry said. If Peter killed Lawrence, who left the defaced photograph in your cottage, Miss Marple? Mrs. Lestrange looked down at her hands. I did. I found it among my mother's possessions. She kept it all these years, a reminder of her past life. When I realized Miss Marple was investigating, I hoped it might warn her away. I never intended harm. And the emerald brooch? Miss Marple asked. Also my mother's. I took it from the Historical Society. It was our family heirloom, after all. I wanted something tangible from the life that was stolen from her. As night deepened around them, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled web of the past and how it continued to ensnare the present. Eleanor Hargreaves had escaped one fate, only to live a life shadowed by fear and secrecy. Her daughter had returned seeking resolution, only to become entangled in fresh deception and death. What will happen now? Mrs. Lestrange asked quietly. Justice, I hope, Miss Marple replied. For Lawrence Redding, for your mother, and perhaps even for Emily Watkins, whose sacrifice has gone unacknowledged for too long. Sir Henry nodded solemnly. The full story will finally come to light, though it may tarnish some respected names. Truth often does, Miss Marple observed, her eyes on the stars above. But like a photograph in a dark room, it cannot remain submerged forever. Eventually it must emerge into the light. Chapter 6. The Final Exposure. A week after Peter Carmichael's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the mild spring sunshine. The roses were beginning to bloom, their delicate fragrance filling the air. The village of St. Mary Mead had gradually returned to its usual rhythms, though the events surrounding Lawrence Redding's murder remained the primary topic at every tea-table and shop counter. Sir Henry Clithering appeared at her garden gate, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the neatly trimmed lawn. "Good morning, Henry," Miss Marple greeted him. "Do join me. I've just made a fresh pot of tea." Sir Henry settled into the wicker chair beside her, accepting the offered cup with a grateful nod. "I thought you'd like to know that Carmichael has made a full confession. The case is officially closed." "And Mrs. Lestrange?" Miss Marple inquired. "Returning to London today. She's agreed to restore the emerald brooch to the Historical Society, though as Eleanor's daughter, she does have some claim to it." Sir Henry sipped his tea thoughtfully. "A most remarkable case, Jane?" "Yes, though not entirely unfamiliar in its essentials," Miss Marple replied. "Human nature changes very little over the years. The desire for revenge, the fear of scandal, the desperate acts committed to protect one's family name. I've observed similar patterns many times, though usually on a smaller scale. What I find most extraordinary is how Lawrence Redding pieced it all together from old photographs," Sir Henry mused. "A remarkable talent." Indeed. He recognized what so many of us fail to see, that the camera captures truth that the eye often misses. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "I believe it's time I showed you something, Henry." From her knitting bag, she withdrew a small envelope containing the photograph of the village green that Redding had sent her. This was his final message to me. "Some things develop only in darkness," he wrote. Sir Henry examined the photograph with interest. "And what did it reveal to you?" "Look closely at the mirror positioned on the stone wall," Miss Marple instructed. "It reflects something just out of frame, the corner of Gossington Hall's gatehouse, where Redding lived. But it also shows a figure watching from an upstairs window of the vicarage." Sir Henry squinted. "I can just make it out. Is that—" "Peter Carmichael, yes. This photograph was taken 3 days before Redding's murder, showing that Carmichael was watching him from the vicarage, where he was supposedly attending a church committee meeting." "Remarkable," Sir Henry murmured. "But why send this to you specifically?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Lawrence and I had corresponded briefly before his arrival in St. Mary Mead. He'd read about my involvement in previous cases, and sought my advice on certain historical aspects of the village. He came to trust my discretion, and, I suspect, my ability to see patterns where others might not." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, looking uncharacteristically subdued. Miss Marple, Sir Henry. He greeted them with a stiff nod. I've just come from interviewing Colonel Bantry. He's agreed to make a statement regarding his father's involvement in the Hargreaves affair. A difficult decision for him, Miss Marple observed. Yes, though he insists he knew nothing of it until now. Slack hesitated. We've also received the results from the laboratory on the negatives found in Redding's hand. Despite the exposure to moonlight, they've managed to recover partial images. And, Sir Henry prompted, they show the Abbey ruins, taken from various angles, but one frame clearly captures Mrs. Lestrange retrieving something from the hidden compartment in the wall. The same wall where you found the empty space, Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The missing letters, I expect. Documentation of the original arrangement between Eleanor and Lord Bantry. Most likely, Slack agreed. We may never know the full contents. Mrs. Lestrange admits to burning them the night after Redding's murder. After Inspector Slack departed, Sir Henry remained, his expression troubled. There's one aspect of this case that continues to disturb me, Jane. The body found at the Abbey ruins in 1899. If it wasn't Eleanor Hargreaves, but her maid, Emily Watkins, how did she die? That, Miss Marple replied quietly, is perhaps the darkest part of this story. Mrs. Lestrange shared her mother's diary with me yesterday. Eleanor wrote that Emily had agreed to help her disappear, to stage a suicide that would end all pursuit. But as the day approached, Emily began to have doubts, threatened to confess all to Lord Bantry. So, Eleanor killed her? No, though she blamed herself till the end of her days. It was Lord Bantry who arranged Emily's death, making it appear as if Eleanor had taken her own life. A single crime became two, the murder of an innocent young woman and the erasure of Eleanor Hargreaves. Sir Henry shook his head sadly. And Peter Carmichael discovered this through Lawrence's research? Yes. His grandfather, the magistrate, had kept records of his dealings with Lord Bantry. Insurance, he called it. Peter found these documents among his family papers and realized their value as blackmail material. Then approached Colonel Bantry, threatening to expose his father's crimes unless he was paid. Precisely. Colonel Bantry paid once, thinking it would end the matter. But such things rarely do. When Lawrence Redding began his investigation, Peter feared exposure and saw only one way to silence him. The garden fell quiet, save for the gentle buzzing of bees among the roses. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour. I visited Mrs. Lestrange this morning before she departed, Miss Marple said at length. She showed me one final photograph that Lawrence had given her, the last image of Eleanor Hargreaves taken in St. Mary Mead before her disappearance. It shows her at a village fete, smiling despite the circumstances surrounding her. Behind her stands Emily Watkins, loyal to the end. What will become of Mrs. Lestrange now? Sir Henry asked. She plans to write her mother's story, to give Eleanor and Emily the voice they were denied in life. Some measure of justice, however delayed. That evening, after Sir Henry had returned to London, Miss Marple received a small package by courier. Inside was a framed photograph of the Abbey ruins at sunset, taken by Lawrence Redding during his first week in St. Mary Mead. Accompanying it was a note from Mrs. Lestrange. He would have wanted you to have this, a reminder that even in ruins, beauty and truth can be found, with deepest gratitude for bringing light to long-buried shadows. Miss Marple placed the photograph on her mantelpiece, struck by how the setting sun illuminated the ancient stones, transforming them from ominous ruins to dignified monuments of endurance. Lawrence Redding had captured not just a landscape, but a metaphor, for secrets long buried, for lives disrupted by deception, and for truth that eventually emerges from shadow. The telephone rang, breaking her reverie. It was Dolly Bantry, inviting her to dinner at Gossington Hall. "The Colonel wants to thank you properly, Jane," Dolly explained. "He says that despite the pain of learning about his father's actions, he feels a certain peace in finally knowing the truth." Miss Marple accepted the invitation, though she knew the evening would be tinged with melancholy. The Hargreaves case had left no one untouched. Not the Bantrys, not Mrs. Lestrange, not even Peter Carmichael, whose bitterness had led him to murder. As she prepared for the evening, Miss Marple paused before the mirror, noting the changes time had wrought upon her own face. Age had its disadvantages, to be sure, but it also brought perspective. She had lived long enough to see how secrets eventually surfaced, how the past remained alive in the present, how patterns of human behavior repeated themselves across generations. Lawrence Redding had understood this too, had seen through his camera lens what others missed with the naked eye. In his final message to her, "Some things develop only in darkness," he had captured an essential truth. Some revelations required patience, required the right conditions to emerge. Like a photographic negative in a dark room, immersed in chemicals and timing, the truth would eventually reveal itself to those patient enough to wait. The village of St. Mary Mead would continue, absorbing this latest drama into its collective memory. New stories would unfold, new secrets would be kept and revealed. But Miss Jane Marple would remain, observing it all with her sharp blue eyes, understanding human nature in all its complexity, bringing clarity to what others saw only in shadow. She took one last look at the photograph of the Abbey ruins before departing for Gossington Hall. Lawrence Redding's final work had captured not just stone and light, but the passage of time itself, how it altered perspectives, softened harsh edges, and eventually, inevitably, brought all things into focus.